Hi all, let's go over another exciting game from the FIDE Grand Prix played in Khanty-Mansiysk, so in Russia. This was in round 8. Baadur Jobava 2699 was playing Hikaru Nakamura, currently rated 2799. Let's see this game. D4, knight f6, and Jobava does have a fetish for this next move, knight c3, which I've often played in blitz. It's a good kind of surprise weapon of choice, getting into less theoretical territory. D5, bishop f4, bishop f5, and now white plays f3. So this might imply a later e4 or even e4 or even g4 later, just to gain a bit of space. But it does incur weaknesses, this kind of approach. e6 and now g4 immediately. So trying to gain some space. h4 threatening to trap the bishop. Nakamura reacts with h5, not just h6 but h5, hitting g4, provoking white forward a bit more. g5. Knight retreats. e3. Now here the b5 square might be useful, you know, if c5, maybe knight b5. So this is taken away with this next move, a6. Maybe black wants to play like c5, which looks like just basically undermining white's pawn chain. And with this pawn moved on f3, this would be like trying to expose the weakness of this diagonal a bit more. Bishop d3. Naka takes this off. C takes, bringing a pawn to the center. Okay, doubling the pawns, but the c file could be useful for white. There's lots of ups and downsides of white's play, but he has made a lot of pawn moves. If you look at white's position, you could say, yeah, there's a lot of potential weaknesses here. Knight c6. Interestingly, Naka does not play for c5, but knight c6, as though perhaps in the future the knight could be useful for an e5. Maybe this knight's going to go here to protect d5 at some point. And then maybe bishop d6 and e5 later. So it's interesting, blocking the c pawn, the kind of Shigurin style. White now does something very interesting. He sacks a pawn, g6, giving black double pawns if he wants to take it. Does Naka want to play f6? Okay, so with this move g6, it's an interesting pawn sack. Naka actually takes this. Maybe f6 would be a bit of a problem actually, in terms of giving white not just a dangerous pawn, but maybe h5 later could be potentially vulnerable. It doesn't seem great to leave that pawn on g6. Maybe it's going to be supported later, and it creates a dislocated pawn on h5. So actually Naka took it, and now bishop g5. So although black's a pawn up, you know, these are double pawns, and for the foreseeable future g5 is locked down now after bishop e7 with f4. So there's quite a bind on these two squares, e5 and g5 right now. And with knight c6, it seems as though black's not putting any pawn pressure on the center at the moment. So will this situation change? Mind you, there's weaknesses though, like g4, and Naka looks at g4 immediately with knight f6, and that could look at e3. So queen b3, queen d7, offering the b7 pawn. It can't be taken here. If taking, this is just an example. Rook b8 and then knight b4 hitting here, and there's going to be knight c2 later. If queen a4, we could just take and then knight c2, for example. So yeah, that can't be taken. Instead, knight f3, and then we have knight g4, looking at e3, and also maybe offering like the exchange of bishops here. King e2, bishop f6. So there's some piece pressure on the center, if not pawn pressure. Rook ac1, and now it is getting potentially dangerous to keep looking at queen takes b7, if it's working or not. Here, b6, just sorting that out now. Rook c2, as though the rooks are going to be doubled to put pressure on this. It seems, you know, quite a target, the c6 and c7 pawns here. Is Nakamura's queen side under great pressure or not? Knight e7. Well, with this, unblocking the c pawn, maybe You can go there later. Knight can go to f5. So rook hc1, black castles, queen a4. Now Naka avoids the exchange of queens with queen d8, knight d1. Quite a lot of manoeuvring. And now actually the decision not to play c6, but instead rook a7. So keeping weaknesses to a minimum. Just a slightly awkward looking rook placement. But it's often seen in variations of the Slav defense, actually, this kind of thing. Knight f2. Knight drops back. Maybe it's go to f5 now. Rook g1. But actually it goes to f7. Sneaky knight. Queen a3. King h7. Knight h3. Quite a long manoeuvring game now. Knight d6. As though, again, f5 is of interest. Knight e5. It looks as though there's potential pressure on g6 though. Is that a worry? Knight to df5, b4, which seems a bit committal actually. It is a way of quickly getting the queen perhaps over here if needed. But with queen d6 it seems as though black's got a target which is useful to peel open the a file. And we see this now. Queen c3, and now finally c6 here to block this c file. But it remains that a5 could be useful for black, and in fact after knight f3 that's used now. Takes, and we've got a backward pawn basically as a target. Queen d2, where is the queen going? Rook a3, rook gc1, and doubling the rooks here on the a2 pawn. Knight f2, c5, yes, it's a long manoeuvring game, and finally Nakamura has reached a position where he's actually challenging the centre with a pawn, finally. So D takes, B takes, bringing a pawn closer to the centre, but it's a sacrifice or an exchange. It's rather a trade of C5 for A2, an exchange of prisoners, as Nimzovich has termed. Sometimes there's an exchange of prisoners which both sides agree to. So rook takes C5, rook takes A2, and now we have a couple of rooks coming off, with white for the moment seemingly in control of that c-file in some way, but there's a check, and then there's another check, and now the queens come off. We're simplifying. Knight ef5. Black remains here technically a pawn up, but of course it's double pawn, but he's hitting e3, that moves. Bishop takes g5. Finally these bishops get exchanged off. So it's two knights versus two knights. What is going on here? Well, knight e2 is a bit of a worry here, hitting the rook, and f4. Knight h3 protecting f4. Rook a3. It seems as though black's got the pressure on white's structure here, and this knight in particular seems better than these two knights at the moment. f5. E takes f5. E takes d5. Knight ge2 hitting the rook. The rook moves. Now rook takes d3. Now knight c4. I think white has his sights on mating black already, like this, with using the double pawns. Rook takes h3. Knight e5, and yes, sacking a piece to get this knight e5 in to f7 seems really dangerous now. Nakamura has to be concerned about this. This is really serious stuff. Is he actually going to get mated with the rook and knight? So he actually gives back a piece here with knight f3, basically giving back a piece to get rid of this attacking knight, or rather not to get rid of it here. This is interesting. He doesn't actually take the knight, he just uses it to gain a bit of time to defend against this mating net mechanism. So not rook takes f3. This might actually leave white more than okay because of this d pawn. So what he does is actually knight f4, hitting the d pawn and keeping, basically two attacks here. King f2, knight takes d5, and again white goes in for this as though knight f7. Resourceful defense is needed. Rook c3, hitting the rook. Rook moves. Now knight e7, facilitating rook c8 as a defense. So in the case of knight f7, there's rook c8 defending against this mating idea. Rook d7. Check. And now a pawn sack to get the knight to f5 now. Rook d8, again repeating the idea of trying to mate. Quite persistent, this Jobava chap. So persistent for knight f7 and rook h8. Check, check. And now we have coverage of f7, so h4, so there's no f7 use for the knight. Rook d4, knight f5, rook d8 again. Knight g3 again protecting, rook d4, and now rook f5 changing, avoiding repetition. So black is technically 2 pawns up, but with this move he's giving up the h4 pawn, leaving just his double pawns. Is that really an extra pawn up here? Well, actually he's gaining a pawn here. There's still a double attack now, so it'll be 2 pawns but 2 double pawns. Rook takes g5. Can black actually win from this position? King d5, rook g1, king e6, rook f1, rook h2, check. And the king has stepped kind of away from potentially saving against a passed pawn here. It's on this side of the board, it's kind of cut off, if you notice, from coming back too easily. So king g8, something to bear in mind. Now this implies a pawn sack, which is accepted and simplifies the position here. Knight takes g6 was played. So Naka is only a pawn up now in this rook and pawn ending, but the king is critically cut off. Is this really enough to win? Rook a6. Well, g6, rook f6, check, king g7, threatening to win the rook immediately. Rook f3, rook a5, keeping the king cut off. Check, rook f1, and then the pawn moves. Yes, it seems difficult to stop this pawn. King f6, and now what seems to be a really impressive move to try and win this position. I think a very accurate looking move. Can you guess what black plays here? Maybe it's important for rook and pawn endings to check this ending out. What would you play here if I gave you 5 seconds starting from now? Okay, rook a4. Yes, because if like the king moves, it seems the check, it's going to like be a real nuisance. The checks are going to be a total nuisance. So yeah, rook a4 is played. So if the check, then there's rook h4, and the pawn is too quick for the white king position at the moment. Rook h1, rook h4 is played, and now check to kick king off this f file. King g6, rook h1, and now rook a4, saying basically the king's cut off, and this pawn's going to go forward. And here on move 80, Baadur Jobava resigned. So with this win, actually, Nakamura, with this very, very important win, Nakamura is looking like he's going to be a qualifier for the FIDE candidates at this rate. If he can win or get first in this tournament, that would really help. But there's still a few rounds to go. This is only round 8. Yes, it goes for a few more rounds. So yes, a bit of a grueling game, obviously, to go over. Not so easy, and very dynamic, creative player as you expect from Baadur Jobava. A very innovative opening. He sticks with his 2 knights e3 system, but his results were a bit bumpy, a bit up and down. So Nakamura taking all his chances and defending resourcefully there against the constant mating net threats, and eventually getting down to just a single pawn up in this rook and pawn ending, which he manages to get a winning position. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.